Hello everyone and welcome to Spooky History. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Just a couple of things before we begin. If you have any questions during the show, during the talk, just pop them down in the comments and we'll get to them in the second half. Also, if you are new to online lectures, then everything's going to be happening in your screen and hopefully you can hear me okay. If you are having any issues hearing me, again, just leave a comment in the comment section. They are being monitored by my producer, who will be able to kind of poke me and say, "Oh, turn the volume up a little bit." So, welcome to Spooky History. My name's Ash Price. If you haven't heard of Spooky History before, Spooky History is a weekly web series. It goes out every Thursday to coincide with Folklore Thursday, and it goes out on YouTube. You can find us on most social media at Spooky Hist Show, and we post up the links to the videos there. Spooky History started last year during the first great lockdown. And like a lot of people in the creative industries, I was looking for things to do, and I love the spooky and I love the history, and so I decided to do this channel. It's an entire team of people who put it together. I am merely the face that presents it. We have a wonderful writing team, and we have a wonderful editor who puts the videos together for us, so it's a real team effort. What we're going to be looking at in today's episode, or today's special live stream, should I say, is we're going to look at a couple of stories that have been covered in episodes. We're also going to be looking at some stories that haven't yet been covered and may not yet get covered. The stories are going to mostly focus around Edinburgh or wider Scotland, or focus on people that have got a connection to Edinburgh in some way, shape or form. So famous people who came from here who have been associated with the spooky history. Just kind of a content warning before we go on. The topics we're going to be discussing here will feature all sorts of macabre and dark elements. So, maybe younger viewers, a couple of times during the talk, you may want to just cover their ears. So, what are we going to be talking about in spooky history? Well, we're going to be covering stories about Major Thomas Weir, the Cottingley Fairies, something called the Storm Kelpies. We're also going to be looking at people like Helen Duncan, and there'll be a mention of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, one of Edinburgh's most famous sons. It's going to be in two different styles. Some of them are going to be like this setup with me here in this window, and the slides just down there. So for those of you who are missing this could have been a email meeting work setup, we will have PowerPoint for you. Also, some of them are going to involve lovely little video backdrops with some music while I read our wonderful scripts written for us by our wonderful script writers, and you'll have an opportunity to just sit back, relax, put your feet up, have a cup of tea or coffee, or in my case, lemsip. Grab yourself a jammy dodger and just listen to tales of Edinburgh and Scotland of old. The first story we are going to be covering is the tale of one of Edinburgh's most mysterious, most macabre individuals, a gentleman who lived in the 17th century, in the centre of the city. I talk, of course, of Major Thomas Weir. This is from a script by R.H. Hale, who wrote all of our first dozen or so episodes. So, sit back, relax, and let me take you back to 17th century Edinburgh. Open your eyes. At your feet are old street cobbles lined with muck. A growing hum of... Oops, sorry, just changing around the audio there. Open your eyes. At your feet are old street cobbles lined with muck. A growing hum of voices fills your ears. Sewage, smoke, and sweat fills your nostrils. It is the 21st of May. The year is 1650. You can barely move. You're hemmed in, squashed on all sides by shoving shoulders in a sea of eagerly expectant faces. We find ourselves caught in one of the most formidable audiences in the world, the Edinburgh mob. And they only get this excited over one thing. Someone is about to die. But not just anyone. Look, here he comes now. Hear the mob go ecstatic. The man you're about to see executed is and will hereby always be remembered as one of the biggest political figures in the Scottish history, and that man is James Graham, Marquis of Montrose. Former Captain General and Covenanter cum Royalist, hence traitor to his old comrades. His war victories will be romanticised by Sir Walter Scott and John Buchan. He will be remembered, revered and panned forever. He is the big news of the day, hung, drawn and quartered. He is the main story. But he isn't the one we're here to see. I just personally love the irony. What irony? Well, if you can hear me over the noisy mob, keep looking. Stand on tiptoe. Now spot the man leading the escort, taking Montrose to the gallows. Grim countenance, air of a soldier. See him? Good. Focus on him. If you will, for he is the recently appointed commander of the town guard. What makes this scene so poetically ironic is that that man no one's noticing right now is likewise destined for immortalisation in Edinburgh history, for crimes infinitely more horrific and diabolical. One day, it'll be he the crowd screams at. One day, he'll be bigger news, and his legacy will terrify more generations than Montrose ever could. With that, let us leave this politically charged mob and follow our commander of the town guard back home, through the narrow wynds of the old town, a peculiar wooden staff tapping its way ahead of him, past the rats and through the shadows, straight into the dark, supernatural coils of the secret world. His world. The underworld. Ladies and gentlemen, you are now in the presence of Major Thomas Weir. Anyone of decent upbringing in 17th century Edinburgh could have told you Major Weir needed no introduction. His reputation already preceded him as a veteran soldier with a long military career in the Scottish anti-royalist army and devout Presbyterian signatory to the Solemn League of Covenant. The man was captain of the town guard. This is the man who escorted the great Montrose to execution. He was descended from the Weir de Veres, one of the oldest and most respected families in the country. His extreme devotion to Calvinism earned him such names as the Bowhead Saint and Angelic Thomas. His famous prayer meetings were apparently so beguiling they reportedly drew crowds from over 40 miles away to his home. So, an angelic saint. What could there possibly be to complain about? It wasn't that his mother, Jean Somerville, was reputedly a clairvoyant, or that in the town guard he was known for cruelty towards prisoners. It wasn't that his animated preaching bordered on the maniacal, nor that he reinforced the faith of married women visiting only when their husbands were out. Indeed, any allegations of indecent conduct on his part were quickly swept under the rug, with a whipping in store for the woman who dared slander such a respected man. That sinister cane or staff of his was difficult to miss, though, creepy, topped with a carved human head. The Major went nowhere without it. Tap, tap, tap. It followed along on the cobbles wherever he walked, followed, or led. Either way, everything was about to change. Trouble is, go round shouting you a devil worshipper today. People, after laughing, will call you mad. Go round shouting you a devil worshipper in the 1600s, people would still call you mad for openly signing your death warrant with your big mouth, witch or no witch. By 1670, Major Weir was comfortably retired and residing in the West Bow by the Grassmarket with his spinster sister Jean Griselle Weir, only a few years his junior. Accounts vary as to the manner in which one day, without warning, he decided to throw 70 years of his respected name into the gutter. Some reports say he suddenly stepped up in the middle of a church service and blurted his confessions before the heavens and a gape-mouthed congregation. Others say it was during one of his frequent prayer meetings. But a more reliable version states it was on his sickbed during a serious illness. So shocked and shocking was his sudden confession, and from one of Edinburgh's model citizens, for God's sake, it's hardly surprising these crimes of a most revolting nature were at first put down as delirium or insanity. The Lord Provost, Abbotshall, immediately sent for doctors to evaluate his mental health. Even so, there was no silencing the man's ravings, and he sought no forgiveness for his crimes. But what crimes? Let's run down a quick tick list, shall we? Decades of a double life spent as an occultist, witch and criminal. Bestiality with a cow and more. Many adulterous fornications, not to mention a unsisterly relationship with his sister Griselle, whom he also named a witch. Now, that's already quite bad, and accusing his sister too, poor lady. Think that was bad? Well, grab yourself some popcorn, my friend, sit back and just listen to what his sister had to say. When questioned, Griselle not only corroborated everything her brother confessed, but rambled a seemingly endless list of further atrocities, including her dealings with the Queen of the Fairies, necromancy and the use of demonic familiars, that their late mother was likewise a witch, a compact with the devil between her brother, and Satan. After which Satan stamped a horseshoe mark on her forehead and treated her and the Weirs to a lengthy return trip to a faraway town in a hellish coach of 6 horses made entirely of blazing fire, and that upon this compact with the devil, she and her brother each received a special gift to seal the bargain. For Griselle, a huge quantity of yarn to spin for profit. For Thomas, that very same, very creepy wooden staff we've already mentioned. Griselle said, if he, Thomas, chances to get it into his hands, he would certainly drive them all out of doors, notwithstanding all the resistance they could make, and that he did many wondrous things with it, particularly that he used to lean upon it in his hypocritical prayers. She told authorities the accursed item essentially had a mind of its own, that it literally followed ahead of Weir in the dark streets, enabled and empowered all of Weir's dark magic, and she specifically warned them he could only be safely imprisoned once the staff was taken beyond his reach. Insanity or not, there was nothing else to do but arrest and imprison brother and sister in the Edinburgh Tolbooth. Their trial took place on the 9th of April 1670. Griselle was charged with sorcery and witchcraft, and conversing with a familiar spirit. But incidentally, none of the formal charges brought against Thomas Weir made any direct reference to witchcraft. Officially, he was tried with incest, bestiality, and adultery. Perhaps either the law still took his ravings as a sign of lunacy, or this was a last-ditch attempt at saving face to protect the public image of his class, as one does. Apart from the testimony of their sister, Margaret Weir, that she had once caught Thomas and Griselle in the same bed in their birthday suits, the only real evidence was their freely given confessions. A boring day for the jail torturer. No persuasion required, no thumbscrews, nothing. Despite the reduced charges against Weir, his persistence quickly landed the siblings a verdict of guilty. Thomas Weir was sentenced to be garroted, then burned at the stake on a road bordering Edinburgh and Leith called Gallowlee, aka Gallows Field. When the day arrived in April 1670, Major Weir, Angelic Thomas, the bowhead saint, was urged to pray for forgiveness. This is what he replied. "Let me alone, I will not. I have lived as a beast, and I must die as a beast." And so he was strangled, then burned, and that demonic wooden staff thrown into the flames with him. But something wasn't right. Wood should burn. The flames were fierce. A silly amount of time passed, and still the accursed staff, gifted to him by Satan himself, would not burn. The mob was alarmed. They watched and stared until their eyes nearly wept in the flames' glare. Then something happened. It moved. It twisted. It turned and coiled in the intense heat. That carved human face, did it contort? The wooden staff burned abnormally slowly, according to witnesses, and some later said the carved face wailed in agony. Griselle met her end next with a hanging in the grouse market, but not without adding her own personal spice to the event by attempting a very uninvited full-body strip before God and the mob of hapless onlookers. Shrub Hill is where their remains were laid to rest. Major Weir, saint, soldier, model citizen, occultist, warlock, witch, wizard, or a textbook case of a complete breakdown. Genetically shared at that. True, that makes it easily explainable. But they left an echo behind, one that refused to go away. Their house, even the very spot on which it stood, said to be haunted and possess evil charms. It contained a bewitched staircase that always gave visitors the sensation of descending instead of climbing. Disembodied eyes were seen at the windows, animalistic laughing, strange lights and unnatural outlines of shrieking figures moved inside. The house terrified people. So much that it was over 100 years before anyone dared to live there again. The by now very cheap house was eventually purchased by ex-soldier William Patullo and his wife in 1780. They lasted but a single night. Accounts say husband and wife fled in terror before the sun was even up, because after every horror you've heard surrounding the Major, after every terror told of the house since, can you even guess what unimaginably awful thing must have greeted them in the middle of the night, staring fixedly from the bottom of their bed? A calf. Variations aside, that detail features most consistently in all historical accounts. One ghostly baby cow, probably still angered from Weir's leanings. That was the last time any living person inhabited the property. Finally, the house was torn down in 1830, and the world was finally rid of it. But not the stories, no. For to this day, the spot remains a feared part of Old Town folklore, as do tales of a staff without an owner tapping its way along the cobbles, searching for its bygone Major, the most famous witch in Edinburgh. Others still claim to see the fiery carriage rampaging down the Royal Mile. Well, that's a story, isn't it? Major Thomas Weir is one of Edinburgh's most famous witches, and it happened kind of towards the end of the major witch trials that were happening under James and, to a lesser extent, Charles. But what a tale. What a story. Major Thomas Weir's tale is one of the earliest videos we put out on Spooky History, and you can check it out on our YouTube channel. Find it via our links, Spooky Hist Show. But I want to talk about something now that this woman's one of my favourite people throughout history. Helen Duncan. Helen McFarlane Duncan. Or McFarlane McRae Duncan. She grew up just outside of, a bit far away from Edinburgh. She was born in Perth in 1897. And she moved to Edinburgh and spent a lot of her life living there. She was a medium. She was a psychic. The mediumistic craze of spiritualism began in the 1840s. Some of you may remember that I gave a lecture on the Fox Sisters a few months ago and barely scratched the surface of spiritualism. As a stage magician who focuses on the paranormal, spiritualism has hugely impacted what I do, and Helen Duncan is one of the most interesting people in history. To some people, Helen Duncan is a martyr who was abused by the state in order to protect the war effort. To others, she is a fraud who committed such outlandish acts of fraud, it's amazing that anyone ever believed her. Helen Duncan was a physical manifestation medium. This means that she would conjure up ectoplasm. One of the pictures you can see is a recreation. This isn't taken at one of her seances. This was taken as a photograph for an Australian magazine. And the ectoplasm you can see coming out of her nose. This is supernatural slime. It is the spirit world manifesting in our world. And it would form figures. Lots of manifestation spiritual mediums existed. Florence Cook and Katie King were one of the most famous. Marjorie, who was Houdini's nemesis, she was another one. And Helen Duncan, who is probably the most famous. She would bring forth spirits in her seance. The room would go dark. She would be in a cabinet. And ghosts would materialize. Spirits of the recently or long departed. But some people did not trust Helen. Some people believed that Helen was a fraud. And this was borne out. In 1933, she was arrested for a seance in Edinburgh, and she was taken to the sheriff's court, and she was found guilty. Basically, she did a seance, a ghost came through, and somebody lunged at the ghost. And would you Adam and Eve it, it was Helen Duncan in a costume. So she was taken, she was charged, and she was found guilty. Now, I cannot find the exact sentence she received. It's either a £10 fine or prison. If it had been prison, I think there would be more made of it. So I'm inclined to believe it was the fine. But finding the actual records has proven tricky. Helen continues her mediumistic twirl, and she starts doing a lot of seances down in Portsmouth, which is a lovely part of the country. And during the 1940s, she's down there quite a lot. There's a place called Copner Road, and there's a building there, 301 Copner Road. Last time I was there, I visited it. It was a jeweller's, second-hand jeweller's. It's now some business firm. I tried getting in touch with them, but they're not fast at responding. I think they want to kind of disconnect from the history, which is a shame. And I went down there, and it was wonderful seeing the space. We didn't get to go into the actual seance room, which was above the shop. It used to be run by a couple called the Helmers. It was an apothecary, medicines and such like. But they had one of Portsmouth's most famous and popular spiritualist centres. Now, in 1944, Helen is doing a seance there. I'm going to start mixing my history a little bit because I'm going to tell you the official accepted account that most people tell. Helen does a seance in 1944, and she brings through a sailor. This sailor is from the HMS Barham, and he says, "My ship has been sunk, all lives lost." Now, at the moment, this was a state secret. No one knew about the Barham sinking. So this got the attention of the authorities. D-Day's coming up. We can't have secrets spilled by a medium to the general public. It will get back to Hitler. So they arrest her. They charge her on a trumped-up charge of witchcraft. And she's sentenced to 9 months in prison. Helen Duncan, the last person charged with witchcraft. She is a martyr to the spiritualist cause. People have been trying for decades to get her sentence overturned. Even Winston Churchill himself got involved, saying how ridiculous the Witchcraft Act was and how unfair it was that it persecuted this innocent, kindly, caring grandmother from Scotland. This is Facebook, so I'm not allowed to swear. But gosh darn it, that is a debatable topic because the actual historical record does not match up with what the story says. We need to break it down. In, I think it was 41, might have been 40, Helen Duncan does a seance at the Helmers Spiritualist Church in Portsmouth. And she does indeed bring through the sailor Worth, with the sailor from the Barham, with the hat band saying HMS Barham on it, saying we've all died. Obviously. That was a secret. Kinda. A couple of problems with the story about the sailor. For a start off, the hat band. In 1941, all HMS ships just said HMS on the hat band, not the name of the ship, because we were in the middle of a little skirmish. Also, as far as a secret goes, that's not the case, actually. It wasn't kept top secret. The fact that the ship, the Barham, had been attacked and torpedoes was public knowledge. It was in all the main press. The fact that it went down with all hands, it wasn't kept secret. It just wasn't made entirely public, in so much as it was informed all the people, the families of the people on the ship. There were about 400 people on the ship, maybe more. And there were potentially thousands of people, many of them who were in the Portsmouth area, knew about the sinking and they knew about the loss of life. So it is entirely possible that Helen Duncan could have received that information. Now, some people suggest that, oh, yeah, but she received it psychically rather than mediumistically, which is a common argument used. But it wasn't a secret. And it also had nothing to do with her arrest at all. This story is 4 years earlier. The arrest happens because of something that happens originally in December 1944. A sailor by the name of Worth goes along to another seance in Portsmouth in December, and he sees the manifestation seance come through, and he goes, I don't quite believe this. So he goes to the police, and the police get back, and they go, right, we're going to attend. And so they attend the next seance in January, and they lunge forward when the ghost appears, and would you believe it, it's Helen Duncan in costume again. The case is taken to court, and she's tried along, not just her manager, or sometimes called her friend. It's not entirely clear what the relationship was. Mrs. Brown, her name was, along with the two Helmers who ran the place. They were found guilty. It was a bit of a show trial. Helen Duncan's lawyer was terrible. His name was Loosby, and he was terrible. In fact, he makes one rookie mistake. You don't have to bring up previous convictions in a trial, and yet he does. He mentions it. He mentions the previous conviction, and the judge calls him over and says, you shouldn't have done that. We can't dismiss that now. We now have to explain the full circumstances of that case to put it in context, which I'm sure counted against her. So that was a terrible move on her defence's part, and he did an awful job of defending her as well. He kept bringing in people who weren't even at the seance to defend her, just people who are satisfied customers. That's not how trials work. And so anyway, she's found guilty, her manager's found guilty, and the Helmers are found guilty. But the judge says, I think the Helmers were taken in just like everyone else, so they get a 2-year suspended. Mrs. Brown gets a few months in prison. I think it was 5 months in prison, and Helen Duncan gets 9 months. Now, the big controversy, the big scandal, comes from the fact that it was under the Witchcraft Act. The biggest problem with the Witchcraft Act is people don't realise what the Witchcraft Act was. The 1735 Witchcraft Act was different to all Witchcraft Acts before it. It didn't persecute witches. By the 1730s, we were in the Age of Enlightenment. We kind of went, hey, if you want to practice witchcraft, as long as you're not skinning a newt and burning it and cursing your neighbours, go have fun. Minor persecutions on a societal level did exist and continue well into the 19th century. But legally, you were fine. And the Witchcraft Act itself was to prosecute frauds. It was to prosecute people who were pretending to have special powers. And that's what she was accused under. That's what she was tried under, and she was found guilty under that. She wasn't even the last person. There was one other woman, Fiona Good, I think it was, who was prosecuted successfully under the Act a few months later, but only got a fine. She didn't go to prison because she was deemed too old. Helen Duncan leaves her prison sentence a bit of a broken woman. To be absolutely honest, I don't think prison was the appropriate response to it. I don't think that was fair. But she got it. And 9 years later, in the 1950s, 1956, she does another seance, and she's again arrested for the exact same things a third time. But this doesn't go to court, and she passes away before that. Helen Duncan is an interesting figure in the history of ghosts and paranormal. She's an interesting figure in Scottish history. Not enough is made about her. Whether you think she was a kindly old granny who was helping bring through the souls of the lost, or if you think she was a con artist, she deserves a bit more attention. She deserves a bit more focus. And she's just an interesting person. I haven't done a spooky history episode on her yet. I'm kind of saving that because I really want to do a deep dive into Helen Duncan because I think she deserves it. So that was Helen Duncan. I want to move on now to something a little bit weird, something a little bit quirky, something a little bit unique. This takes place on the outskirts of Scotland. It takes place in some of the islands in the Outer Hebrides. And it is called the Blue Men of the Minch, or the Storm Kelpies. This is another script that was written by the absolutely wonderful R.H. Hale. Do check her out. She's written 2 novels, the Church Mouse Saga, and they are great books. They're vampires. I don't like vampire fiction. I loved these. They're wonderful gothic horror. Do check them out. So, the Storm Kelpies, or the Blue Men of the Minch. How long could you spend just listening to the sounds of the sea? The waves rise, fall, crash, and lick the gunwales of your boat. The salt crystallizes in your hair and sticks to your taste buds. The winds shave your raw skin, and the sky, darkened on the horizon, turning the water that murky, dull greenish black. Danger, never too far away. And the sky, dark, void swells, ever present beneath you, bobbing your vessel up and down, almost teasing you. You, your whole crew, are alive only because this void permits it. For now. Hoist the sails, coming about round the Sheehan Isles. You've set yourself a course for the lonely Strait of the Minch. Here, notoriously treacherous tides raise the stomach acid to your throat. In the rocky cliffs, caves peer at you like dark eyes. Something's watching you, timing you. You're reminded once more why locals call this strait the current of destruction, as you gasp in a breath of salty air. Geographically, the Minch is an oceanic divide line between the Inner and Outer Hebrides of northwest Scotland, around every 70 miles worth of sea up to 45 miles wide. The Outer Hebrides is a different world, beautiful, steeped in overflowing folklore, since humans settled there millennia ago. How many vessels have been lost out there? Countless, many songs and ballads lament them. The sea is a beauty and a monster, filled with monsters. None know this better than the island communities, for what is survival on an island without the sea? Fishing and shipping trades are their lives' blood. It dominates the culture and salt flows through their veins. Stories, songs, music, mysteries and legends were passed down generations, for nothing couldn't go wrong on the water. Nature plays tricks. The wind roars along with crying gulls. One could almost mistake them for voices and human wailing, and that strange shape floating just beneath the water, like a porpoise or a dolphin. Oh, there's another one. Out there, you see it? We're being followed. Gather all your wits, skipper. They're the only thing that'll save you now, for no sailor can outrun the storm Kelpies. And this was their home. No tales of them abound elsewhere. Legend has it that long, long ago, a tribe of fallen angels dropped to earth, but this was no ordinary fall. The descent split the tribe forever into 3 different phenomena. One became the ground fairies, creatures of mischief, cunning, and magic. The other maintained its freedom to waltz the skies as the merry dancers, or what you would call the Northern Lights. And the third. They're about to capsize your boat and drown your crew. The violent storms they raise will send you all to the bottom of the sea as they look on and laugh. You won't be the first, and you certainly won't be the last. It's what they do. And you've entered their territory during the winter months when they're at their most dangerous. More of them are gathering now, enough for you to see clearly. What you mistook for a pod of dolphins raise slimy grey arms to tread the foam. Between crashing waves, a series of blue heads emerge, marking you with long, grey faces, human-sized yet so inhuman. You've heard the stories, and you know what you're in for. The next few minutes are critical, and shall decide your fate, and the fate of your vessel. For these blue men of the Minch, as they're also known, cannot only speak and understand human language, they have a protocol, and there's nothing you can do about it. You'll have to play along. Are you ready? The game is this. If you're spotted approaching your vessel, there's only one means of escape. The answer of all things in this ancient mystical world is a rap battle. That's right, the Blue Men's chief, named Shoney, surfaces and challenges the skipper with 2 lines of poetry. Your job as captain is to reply with another 2 lines, and so on and so forth. And yes, it seems rhyming was compulsory. By some accounts, they were even bold enough to climb on board. But if you don't play along, or don't answer fast enough, or if Shoney simply doesn't like your rap, sorry, what can I say? Nice knowing you, pal. Tough crowd, this lot. When not creating havoc at sea, these blue men lived in dark caves of the Shion Islands, and were even rumoured to play shinty on calmer summer evenings. Now, like all party poopers, one might be inclined to don their professor's monocle, open a few dusty ledgers and ask, from whence arose this maritime myth? What perfectly natural phenomena inspired such anthropomorphic projection? Well, first, and most likely, you accept we had or still have humanoid sea creatures ready to do a spar with M&M. In fact, manatees and seals have long been mistaken and probably the origin of many mermaid tales. Or second, we do the mundane thing and try equating these tales with some historic fact, and sadly one of their possible origins is no more pleasant than the sinking of ships. That is to say, the slave trade. But we're talking a lot further back than you think. The Viking Era, in fact. Not very many people know that some of the Vikings had slaves, mainly from Africa. And according to the Annals of Ireland, during the 9th century they had travelled with them to Ireland, where on the way they resided on the Sheant Isles. According to folklorist David A. Mackenzie, these blue men were slaves that had been marooned. This argument is further supported by one Scottish Gaelic interpretation of Fair Horma, blue men to black men. Others argue the slaves were in fact North African from Sahara, a population once described as the blue men of the desert. Not only does it end there, no, it doesn't end there. Tongue twisting. We are in a rap battle after all. Another quite different theory is the storm Kelpies were the tattooed or painted people translated from the Latin Picti. Sound familiar? The Picts, whom we still don't know enough about. Indeed, there are precious few recorded sightings of these blue men of the Minch, apart from the tale of one blue man who was captured by sailors, tied to the vessel, then chased by his storm Kelpie brothers, who apparently called themselves Duncan and Donald. Who knows if they sank that particular ship or not, but according to folklore, if you have a sharp wit and a quick tongue, such as the captain in Mackenzie's book, the blue men have no choice but to sail through unharmed. I will leave this little tale with a recreation of one particular rap battle between Shoney, the Blue Man Chief, and the skipper of a vessel. Shoney: Man of the black cap, what do you say as your proud ship cleaves the brine? Responds the captain. My speedy ship takes the shortest way, and I'll follow you line by line. Responds Shoney. My men are eager, my men are ready to drag you below the waves. And finally, captain, my ship is speedy, my ship is steady. If it sank, it would wreck your caves. That is from Wonder Tales from Scottish Myth and Legend by David A. Mackenzie, 1917. I love that story. I love that tale. I think it's just so weird and wonderful. It mixes in folklore and the supernatural, and it's just a beautiful tale. And Scotland is filled with stories like this. I'm going to tell a ghost tale. A ghost story now. This is the story of Johnny One Arm. Johnny One Arm was quite a wealthy man in 17th century Edinburgh. His name was John Cheesley, and he had a wife, and he and his wife were having a divorce, and his wife wanted what was her due. So they went to court, and they were overseen by a chap called George Lockhart, advocate. And George Lockhart found heavily in favour of the wife that she would have to be maintained by John Cheesley, and John did not like this one little iota. So John did what any sensible, rational man would do. He contested the judgment. Nah. John stalked George Lockhart one night on his way home from church. Lockhart gets to his home in Advocates Close, and he hears steps behind him. He turns, and there is John Cheesley with a gun, levelled at Lockhart. The pistol goes off. Lockhart falls dead. Cheesley doesn't do much. He's apprehended. Happily and freely confesses. But they torture him anyway. Quite extensively, actually. We loved our torture. Just not of Major Thomas Weir. So John Cheesley is tortured, and he has the hand he used to fire the pistol lopped off at the wrist. And it's tied around his neck, and he's taken out to the grass market in 1688. And he is hanged by the neck until he's dead. 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 His body's taken down. But it disappears. It disappears, and no one finds it. From that day forth, people wandering down Advocate's Close are said to hear the scraping boots of a figure behind them. Turning, they see nothing. Legend has it is the one-armed John Cheesley. Centuries later, in 1965, just outside the city centre, some building works were being done, and they discovered a skeleton. It was a skeleton of a one-armed man, his hand tied around his neck. We finally found and laid to rest the spirit of John Cheesley. Or did we? Maybe you will wander down Advocate's Close one night all by yourself, and you hear the scrape, scrape, scrape of feet. Edinburgh's got loads of ghost stories like this. We've heard tales of the underground vaults, figures like the Watcher, a darkened figure who wanders around, the Mackenzie poltergeist who says to haunt Greyfriars Cemetery and the Covenanters' prison, the spirit of Bloody Mackenzie, an old advocate. Ghost stories abound, tales all around the city. But I want to end before we go to a short break, and there'll be time for a Q&A. So if you have questions, if you want to know about any other stories, there's loads I can probably dip into. There's other spooky history tales I could probably recount that aren't directly related to Scotland or Edinburgh. So do leave them in the comments. We will get to them in the second half. But I want to end by talking about Edinburgh's most famous son, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So Arthur Conan Doyle created Sherlock Holmes and was also one of the loudest advocates for spiritualism. In fact, we only have the later Sherlock Holmes canon because Doyle needed money to fund his spiritualist speaking endeavours. We have some of the greatest rational-minded literature because Doyle needed money to talk about ghosts and talking to the dead. But in 1917, he became involved in one of the biggest and shockingly convincing, it seemed, scandals. I talk, of course, of the Cottingley fairies. Oh, to be a child again. To disappear from this world into any dream you like. To create your own private universe where every favourite fantasy is real. What child would want to give that up? What bliss? Maybe that's why so many adults can't give it up either. Maybe such fantastical freedom is a drug of hope and release, such as the spark of joy ignited in Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's heart when he first gazed upon the pagan serenity of the Cottingley fairies. You can see the images here, the most famous ones. Top left is the first one that came out. Once upon a time, a young princess sets out on an amazing adventure. In 1917, little 9-year-old Frances Griffiths, you can see her pictured, embarks on a long journey that will forever her life change and immortalise her name. Travelling all the way from South Africa with her mother, the two arrive at the sleepy village of Cottingley near Bradford in West Yorkshire, England. Frances knows no one. She is a friendless stranger. Fortunately, she's not alone for long, for here in Cottingley they dwell with an aunt and her daughter, 16-year-old cousin Elsie Wright, and so a magical friendship begins. The setting couldn't be more perfect. Look for the two enchanted girls, and where you find them, playing by the picturesque stream of Cottingley Beck, at the bottom of their garden, all those wet shoes and clothes they returned home with, all the washing their mothers had to do, what mischief did they get up to at that stream? Were they even alone? But it wasn't me. It was the fairies. How often have you seen one go further and try to prove it was the fairies? Well, it gets handy having a photographer for a dad, doesn't it? And it just so happened that Elsie's father, Arthur Wright, not only had his own darkroom, but a readily available midge-quarter plate camera for her to borrow. One day after playing by Cottingley Beck, the girls returned to the house with the first of a set of images set to bewitch the world for years to come. Again, that's the top left one. As Arthur Wright developed the photographic plate, the following image emerged. Here sits little Frances, gazing seemingly into space with 4 of her new friends. In 1918, she sent this photograph to her friend Joanna Parvin in her former home of Cape Town, ever so casually describing it as, me with some fairies, Elsie took that one. On the back of which she wrote, "It is funny, I never used to see them in Africa, it must be too hot for them there," with all the sensible pragmatism towards fairyland only a child can have. Now, Mr. Wright knew his own daughter, and not only was she a talented artist, but experienced in photography herself. He was therefore quick to dismiss the images as mere cardboard cutouts, and for him, that was the end of it. When 2 months later, the girls proudly produced another photograph, this time featuring Elsie sitting with what appears to be a friendly gnome, the father had had enough of this prank, and assuming they had messed with his equipment, forbade them to use his camera ever again. His wife Polly, as it turned out, was not so tough to convince. After showing both photographs to her local Theosophical Society, this is an offshoot of spiritualism, it's more closely related to Eastern esotericism though, she allowed their display at the Society's annual conference in Harrogate. There they were noticed by prominent member Edward Gardner, who openly viewed the apparent materialisation of fairies as evidence that human evolution was nearing perfection. He sent the pictures to professional photographer Harold Snelling, who concluded they were not fakes but did not specifically verify that they were fairies. Nonetheless satisfied, Gardner had more enhanced negatives printed and continued using the photographs to push his theosophical beliefs, exhibiting and selling them for a pretty penny. Next to arrive on the scene would be the Cottingley Fairies' biggest historical fan. Who would want to disappoint a celebrity that'll otherwise never know your existence? One of the most famous and renowned authors in the world, and passionate spiritualist to boot. Someone sure to believe you. And what an advocate. What an opportunity. Well, what not everyone realises is that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle perhaps already had very personal, if biased, reasons for his interest in defending fairyland. His father Charles Doyle's alcoholism and depression led to a prolonged duration in a psychiatric hospital a number of years. And of all the pieces of art his father produced there, many were paintings of, you guessed it, fairies. Hence, it so happened that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was already writing an article on this very subject for the Strand magazine, when in 1920 he learned of the girls' photographs and subsequently wrote to Gardner and then the Wright family, requesting permission to use their images for his published piece. Interestingly, or wisely erring on the side of caution, Elsie Wright's father agreed to this flattering request from a celebrity, but waived payment. Despite seeking but receiving no concrete authentication from the companies Kodak, Ilford, and physicists at Oliver Lodge, ever-optimistic believers Gardner and Doyle pressed on regardless. During school holidays in 1920, Gardner personally visited the Wright family, bringing with him 2 folding plate cameras, including 24 photographic plates he'd secretly marked, thus also prompting them to invite Frances to stay for summer. Gardner, in 1945, book Fairies, A Book of Real Fairies, said, "I went off to Cottingley again, taking the 2 cameras and plates from London, and met with the family and explained to the 2 girls the simple workings of the cameras, giving 1 each to keep. The cameras were loaded, and my final advice was they need to go to the glen only on fine days, as they had been accustomed to before, and entice the fairies, as they called their way of attracting them, and see what they could get." Poor Mother Elsie was sent off to take tea elsewhere, since according to the girls, fairies don't fancy an audience during photo shoots and won't show up with gawkers about, naturally. Gardner adds, I suggested only the most obvious and easy precautions about lighting and distance, for I knew it was essential they should feel free and unhampered and have no burden of responsibility. Several days later, Gardner would receive some photographic plates in the post. He was not disappointed. The 3 bottom images are the ones he received. No doubt beside himself, an ecstatic Gardner telegrammed Doyle, who was on tour at the time. Both grown men appear happier than the children themselves. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle said to Gardner in 1920, "My heart was gladdened when out here in far Australia, I had your note and the 3 wonderful pictures which are confirmatory of our published results. When our fairies are admitted, other psychic phenomena will find a more ready acceptance." Doyle triumphantly published his article for The Strand in 1920, naming the girls Alice and Iris and the Wright family carpenter for anonymity. Having discovered this, he said, the world will not find it so difficult to accept that spiritual message supported by physical facts which has already been put before them. Doyle would write a second article on the subject in 1921, using the 3 new photographs, and went on to publish The Coming of the Fairies in 22. However, confident Doyle and Gardner were that the world would fling open its arms and embrace the Cottingley fairies as readily as they did, the public reaction was no less entertaining. Maurice Hewlett, John O'London's Weekly. And, knowing children, and knowing that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle has legs, I decide that the Miss Carpenters have pulled one of them. Truth newspaper, Sydney, 1921. For the true explanation of these fairy photographs, what is wanted is not a knowledge of occult phenomena, but a knowledge of children. Ouch. One of the most damning and affronted criticisms of all came from a particularly cheerful ray of sunshine, British medical X-ray pioneer Major John Hall Edwards. I have no hesitation in saying that these photographs could have been faked. I criticise the attitude of those who declared there is something supernatural in the circumstances attending to the taking of these photographs, because, as a medical man, I believe that the inculcation of such absurd ideas into the minds of children will result in later life manifestations of nervous disorder and mental disturbances. But Gardner was not through. Armed with more photographic evidence, later that year he paid a final visit to Elsie and Francis, this time with occultist Geoffrey Hodgson in tow. They could hope all they wanted, because upon arriving in Cottingley these men found what were now 2 weary young girls yawning and bored with this whole affair. So bored, in fact, that they couldn't be bothered to cooperate, telling the gentleman they saw no fairies today. Ironic then, when these 2 children who had started the whole sensation looked on as their adult visitor became the child. One can only guess to what degree occultist Hodgson had gotten his hopes up, but according to his considerable volume of notes, he saw fairies left, right and centre. The hapless children, not taking him seriously for one moment, felt compelled to string him along, and many years later would reflect on a photo of them taken with Hodgson. Look at that. Fed up with fairies. Of course, time passed, public enthusiasm waned despite Doyle sticking to his beliefs, the girls grew up, married and moved on. Even so, much later in life, they would still prove a tough pair of nuts to crack. When press attention briefly resurfaced in 1966, 1971 and 1976, Elsie and Francis acknowledged that fairies couldn't be real, but refused to admit if the photos were faked, instead rigidly insisting the images were figments of our imagination, and that's what I'm sticking to. Elsie. Nevertheless, after 57 years, it appeared the appetite for investigation was back, enough to prompt magician and skeptic James Randi to examine the infamous photographs with the Committee for Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal in 1978. An equally scientific investigation was undertaken by Geoffrey Crawley by the British Journal of Photography in 1982. Using all the latest computer technology and scientific analysis in the face of 2 stubborn old ladies, once playful young children, these spectacularly learned men succeeded not only in telling us what plenty of decent photographers had already said a half-century earlier, but that the fairies were being held upright by strings. Now, known to in fact be hatpins, after a later confession by Elsie and Francis, others have also since pointed out that constantly moving fairy wings would likely be a mere blur on the image, given the technology of the time. Same with the waterfall in the background. You can see it's quite blurry there, whereas the wings aren't. In any case, It was 1983 when Francis and Elise finally revealed in the Unexplained magazine that the fairies were cardboard creations made by Elsie, copied directly from dancing figures of a popular 1914 children's publication, Princess Mary's Gift Book. All the artistic Elsie Wright had to do was add wings and maybe some finishing touches. Francis also told Elsie in her 1983 memoir, "I hated those photographs from the age of 16, when Mr. Gardner presented me with a bunch of flowers and wanted me to sit on the platform at the Theosophical Society with him. I realised what I was in for if I did not keep myself hidden." Let's hope that's not as creepy as it sounds. The photographs and all their paraphernalia have sold for many thousands in the years since, and in any case, one has to admire these two women. Personally, if I had managed to fool some of the supposedly smartest grown-ups in the country at the time, I'd be proud enough to defend that little achievement to the grave too. Elsie, two village kids and a brilliant man like Conan Doyle, well, we could only keep quiet. Francis, I never even thought of it as being a fraud. It was just Elsie and I having a bit of fun, and I can't understand to this day why they were taken in. They wanted to be taken in. But the cousins never seemed to reach an agreement over one particular photograph, the last one taken of the Cottingley fairies, entitled The Fairies and Their Sunbath. That is the bottom right photograph. Seated on the upper left-hand edge with the wing well displayed is an undraped fairy, apparently considering whether it is time to get up. An early riser of more mature age is seen on the right, possessing abundant hair and wonderful wings. Her slightly denser body can be glimpsed within her fairy dress. First of all, both women claim to have taken it. Secondly, according to Elsie, this image was also fake, but not so Francis, who in 1982 stated, "It was a wet Saturday afternoon, and we were just mooching about with our cameras, and Elsie had nothing prepared. I saw these fairies building up in the grasses and just aimed the camera and took the photograph." George Crowley would later suggest, a year later in his letter to the Times, the image was simply a double exposure, thus explaining the confusion. Then again, anyone familiar with fairies knows that they're mischievous, sometimes even wicked enough to take a leaf out of old Nick's book and convince the world they definitely don't exist by hiding in plain sight. Because don't forget, in spite of everything, Elsie and Francis maintained until their dying days that, though most of the famous photographs were indeed faked, the fairies they'd met as children at Cottingley Beck, once upon a time in the long distant past, were in fact genuine, true, and honest. Well, that brings us pretty much to the end. You can find us on most social media at Spooky Hist Show, and there are new videos released every Thursday over on YouTube, and we share them to all of our social media accounts. Not as frequently on Instagram as we should. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and please, do you have nightmares? Goodbye.